Good evening. I'm Simon Gathercole. I'm Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity, and it's my great privilege this evening to introduce to you Professor Simon Goldhill. Simon is Professor of Greek Literature and Culture here in the University of Cambridge, and he's also the John Harvard Professor of Humanities and Social Sciences. Simon has been at King's College for some considerable time, where he's a fellow since, I think, the mid-70s, and he's sort of failed to leave since then. And he's also a fellow of the British Academy and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Social Sciences. And he's received these great distinctions because of his remarkable scholarship. This was first really seen in the publication of his PhD, Language, Sexuality and Narrative. Sorry, I should have said Language, Sexuality, Narrative, asyndetically, as it were, on the Oresteia. And he then produced a broader study of Greek tragedy, reading Greek tragedy, or reading Greek tragedy, I suppose it should be. And since then, he's published a series of remarkable books and articles which have really transformed the field of classical studies, so that many of the influences on classical study today can be traced back to Simon's work. On a personal note, I can say that I first heard Simon speaking at the age of about 16, I think it was. I was 16, not Simon. And he was enthusing to sixth formers about classics and saying that, if you wanted to study literature, you can do English. If you want to study history, you can do history. If you want to study languages, you can do French and German. If you want to study economics, then heaven help you. But if you want to do everything, if you want to do language, literature, history, culture, then do classics. And it was that really enthused me to apply to study classics at King's all those years ago, and to have Simon as my Director of Studies, which was a remarkable experience. And so it's, again, my great privilege to welcome Simon to speak on the Christian invention of time.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Simon, for your very kind words. I should apologize for being somewhat overdressed. I am going on to an alumni dinner. I thought you would all be here doing that too, and I'm very sorry you're not. So it's not really an attempt to look like James Bond. I really do have a dinner invitation. Now, we have had a Syrian refugee living in our house for the last 5 years. And when he arrived, he knew almost no English at all. And one of the first things he learned in English school was the difference between formal and informal language. And one of the first sentences he learnt in formal English was, "I apologize for my lack of punctuality." Now, I don't know if that sentence was thought necessary because he was an adolescent or because he was from the Middle East, but it did seem to catch something for him about English culture and its obsessions. But it's worth reflecting on the idea that punctuality is a virtue, a virtue no less. It's a thoroughly 19th century ideal, and it's an ideal that would have been impossible for almost every century before. Without a ready supply of accurate clocks and an agreed measure of time, punctuality makes no sense. Church clocks might ring the hour from the 14th century onwards, but in Homer and Virgil, nobody ever said, "You're late for the meeting." It's a striking fact that Britain was one of the first countries to have a national time. But it was introduced in the 1860s only when the railway system made it necessary for connections. Even into the 20th century, there was a business in London whose sole job it was to go round correcting clocks to the national time on a daily basis. International time, even harder to agree. The French and the English, of course, argued for decades whether Greenwich Mean Time would be the international standard. And it was only agreed that when the French could have the standard measure of the metre in Paris, that we would get Greenwich Mean Time. And even so, well into the 20th century, the Greeks, of course, insisted that its maps were made to Athens Mean Time. Even in antiquity, the Greeks and the Jews were the two groups who refused the new Roman calendar Julius Caesar's most lasting contribution to world history. The international dateline was agreed only after the Second World War, and some islands found they changed what day it was on one day thanks to international politics. To have one timescale for the whole world seems now not only natural, but necessary. It's really hard to imagine the world without clock time. We know that one sign of being modern is our sense of time. Clocks are everywhere. We time everything from how long to simmer a carrot to how fast Usain Bolt runs. We know what time it is all the time. We know what day of the week it is. We know what century we live in. Again, a sentence that could not be said before the 19th century, the first century to know it lived in a century. We talk continually about how things are speeding up. For Ruskin, it was the train that changed everything and made the world seem to rush past. For cultural historians now, it's become a commonplace that how we think about time changes our very way of living in the world. And modern temporality is a revolution in our way of living, our way of being. Now, it seems to me that it's both true and an important insight into what distinguishes our world from antiquity. But modernity is not the first revolution in time. What modernity is reacting against, what it defines itself against, is itself the result of the most remarkable and far-reaching revolution in time. And that's the transformation of temporality brought about by Christianity in late antiquity. Now, if I asked you all how many of you knew where you were on September the 22nd, you might find it quite hard to answer. If I said, where were you last Wednesday, you'd probably do a bit better. We structure so much of our sense of time through the week, the 7-day system with a day off or two, the weekend. It's indeed hard to imagine how we could organize our lives otherwise. But of course, it's an invention first of the Jews from Genesis and the foundation of the world, where God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. But it was only brought to the general world through Christianity's adoption of the week and the Sabbath and the gradual dominance of the Christian empire. The week was imposed on a Roman calendar, on multiple calendars, quite differently organized. And it's now part of the furniture of everyone's mind across the world. It's quite simply part of how we map time. Now, when you groan on a Monday morning, there's also another Christian heritage too, and I'm not talking about the groaning. In Greece and Rome, there were regular patterns of sacrifice and prayer, in the sense that in Athens, the great Dionysia, for example, the festival at which tragedy and comedy were performed, took place on the same days in the calendar each year, and it began in the morning. But there were no fixed times for things like that. In Judaism, there's a bit of a greater interest in times of prayer, but when the prayer is said to be performed at night, this leads in the Talmud to a discussion of, well, how soon, how late, what does at night mean, how many hours, what's the limits of when you can say it. There are loads of grey areas and possibility. There was no requirement in either Greece or Rome in Judaism for a precise moment of prayer or sacrifice. But Christianity made a big change here. Christianity introduced the 7 canonical hours, each one designed for a particular set of prayers. Night and day, there is a particular and precise moment for each prayer session. Particularly in the monastery, time was regulated assiduously. Daily habit was retrained. Precision was required. Cassian, who writes the first set of institutional rules for the monastery, even tells us when a monk is likely to be depressed, between the 5th and the 6th hour, precisely. Indeed, meal times are meant to be taken at specific times in different seasons. The length of daily work is stipulated, times are defined for each service. In a way that was quite unparalleled in antiquity, monastic rules insist that every hour counts and must be counted, that repetitive, stringent observance of such rules of time are integral to spiritual salvation, that such observance is indeed what they call an office, an imposed duty willingly upheld. The industrious factory of the monastery is the precursor of the industrial factory of the 19th century, or the time and motion studies of the 20th. Christianity introduces the necessity of routine defined by the times of day. The monk's daily repetition of tasks defines his relation to God and how the monk inhabits time, experiences being. It provides a new paradigm, the strangeness of which should not be forgotten. Christianity bequeathed a newly demanding idea of time that was just not regular, regulated, ritualized, but also stridently repetitive and compulsive. Looking to God all the time reorders how life is seen, and the technology of temporal control is integral to how life is shaped. This Christian way of life was an ideal very different from the classical models in which it took shape in and against. Let me try and explain some of the theology that makes sense of a monk's idea of being. For this, back to Greece. The Homeric warrior was a figure whose essence was defined as to be a doer of deeds and a speaker of speeches, and to risk life in the pursuit of glory, an eternal fame memorialized in epic song. To be a hero is to take action, to fight, to search, to gain, to win. Therefore, the great epics of antiquity are all constructed around the tension between grand action and delay, waiting, which is the opposite of grand action. So, for 18 books of the Iliad, Achilles, the best of the Achaeans, refuses to fight. He sits in his tent in a strop at a slight to his honour. His comrades try and persuade him to fight, he refuses. It's only when his best mate Patroclus is killed in his own armour that he's moved to fight again, and thus to commit himself both to his own early death and his everlasting fame. So too the Odyssey is structured around Odysseus' delay from getting home. 8 years on Calypso's island where he can do nothing but cry on the beach. Another year at Circe's, a 10-year gap embodied in the narrative by his 4-book retrospective story of his journey, a sixth of the whole epic. And Aeneas in the Aeneid, as long as he delays with Dido in Carthage, is delaying his heroic fate to be a founder of Rome. Now, these narrative structures in antiquity express a double sense of time. There's chronos, which is the mere passing of time, empty time, when nothing happens to create fame. Then there's kairos, the moment of crisis or action, which is the killing time. And kleos, fame or glory, is the product of kairos. When heroes are waiting, they live in empty time. It's the refusal of their raison d'etre. It's a refusal of the kairos. You can't be a hero who just sits around. Well, Christianity turns this inherited model on its head. First of all, it takes as its model of bravery not the daring do of a hero of action, but the calm suffering of the martyr. Doesn't kill, is killed. The martyr even chooses to die, not like Achilles for everlasting fame, but for the everlasting life of heaven, not for the hero's glory, but for God's glory. And more importantly for my current argument, the very ideas of kairos and chronos are completely transformed. Chronos, waiting time, becomes an ideal. St. Mary of Egypt is a good example. After 17 years as a prostitute, she converts and runs to the desert where she lives for 30 years as an ascetic. When she's spotted for the first time by anyone after 30 years, she looks barely human, naked, emaciated, but her wasting away has been transformed into a sort of transcendent ascetic piety, and she promptly dies. Her new wondrous Christian life in the desert is a remove from all social interactions. The 30 years are described only as a continuum of her turn towards God. It's 30 years of, well, the same. Nothing happens. She just prays in the desert. Nothing happens except her constant spiritual turning to God. Daily life has been transformed into a constant waiting for death that will grant access to heaven, eternal life. Now, the Gospels are quite clear that watching and waiting is what a faithful Christian should be doing. Matthew, for example, is clear that the second coming is to be anticipated, but he also tells the disciples explicitly and through parables about that day and hour. No one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. Hence the repeated injunction, watch therefore, for you do not know on what day the Lord will come. Therefore watch, because you do not know the hour or the day. And Mark adds, look, stay awake, for you do not know when the kairos will come. And of course, the arrival of the Messiah is the very definition of the kairos as an event or turning point. It could, explains Mark, be late or midnight or cockcrow or early. Therefore, watch. You must be ready, says Luke, because the Son of Man is coming at an hour you're not expecting. The prediction of the future demands that our future is one in which we watch and wait. Vigilance, a vigil, is required. For Christians, the gospel demand, anticipating, waiting, expecting, is what the faithful do all the time. You should pray all the time, says Paul. That is how the time of everyday life is to be inhabited. The monk, following Paul's advice to pray constantly, thus spends his whole life in a structured pattern of waiting and turning towards God. So if you're a perfect monk, you have no story. Nothing happens. No epic. St. Augustine, the most profound writer about time from antiquity, gives the most extraordinary example of how much complexity is attracted by this ideal, not least when the Christian also engages in the world and doesn't simply retreat into a monastery. It's Augustine who most fully expresses a Christian theology of time, starting from his famous sentence, I know what time is until someone asks me. St. Augustine certainly has a story. He has many a story. And one of the most amazing parts of his masterpiece, The Confessions, is how he interweaves his theological theory of time with the business of telling his own story of his conversion and what it means to try and understand oneself in time. I just want to focus here on one quite extraordinary moment in the Confessions, the moment of his conversion in the garden. And I have just 2 points to make about what is a wonderfully layered and intricate piece of writing. First point is this. Augustine dramatizes his own anguish before the moment of revelation precisely as the anguish of waiting. He's still desperately broken by the lure of pleasures he must deny, and in misery he cries out, quam diu, cras et cras, quare non mode, quare non hac ora finis turpiditudinis mei. How long? How long? Tomorrow and tomorrow. Why not now? Why is this not the hour of the end of my sinfulness? The psalmist's cry to God, how long, O Lord, is Psalm 13, is Augustine's tortured recognition of his own delay, his inability to act, which is also the deferral of grace, his continuation in sin. As he says, tomorrow and tomorrow, its very utterance performs the delay he's lamenting. He needs the immediacy of a moment. Why is this not the hour? Why not the kairos now? Well, Augustine's extraordinary narrative is a desperate plea to experience the immediacy of a present that because of his divided self, his interior human life, he cannot reach by himself without God's grace. Augustine shows that waiting itself can become a sinner's drama. Grace cannot be demanded or made to happen. It can only be waited for. When Augustine cries out, quam diu, how long? He's dramatizing the waiting for grace as a model of Christian waiting. How a person inhabits time, how you see yourself acting or being in the world, is transformed by this theology. The self is in constant deferral. Life is a preparation for the afterlife. Now, this leads to my second point. Once Augustine has had his transformative moment of conversion, he runs straight to his mum, Monica, to tell her. Now they celebrate together that Augustine will no longer seek a wife, nor any hope of this age, nothing the age can offer. He and his mother will no longer seek a family, the grandchildren of my flesh, as she puts it, which his father had previously hoped for, much to the embarrassment of Augustine in his adolescence. But immediately on conversion, Augustine and Monica, son and mother, recognizes that what he's done by converting is to reject the possibility of the future of his own family. There will be no children. There will be no continuity. This is the fulfillment of the most shocking radicalism of Christianity. For Greeks, Romans, and Jews, the continuity of the family, the future of the household, the bloodline, is one of the most basic principles of ethics and civic value. Augustine, like many serious Christians in late antiquity, rejects this possibility. His family will die out. He wills its destruction. And he and his mother together celebrate it. This willing rejection of a privileged ideal of the future changes how a person thinks about how biology, time, social life interact to make a social norm. Now it is an ideal to be a monk or a nun or a priest or a bishop, not merely to reject the lure of sex, but also to deny the possibility of a family. This total disruption of the inherited expectations of social life completely changes how a person sees himself in time. Now, everything is for the time to come, the life after death. For Augustine, human experience of time is fragmented, painful, marked by ignorance, doubt, hope, recollection, repentance, disappointment. Such experience is set in contrast with God's time. God is outside time. God's knowledge is perfect. God does not experience time or its contingencies. And God's time was at the heart of fierce and violent Christian polemic throughout late antiquity. For the Arians, there was a time when he was not. That is, there was a time when the Son, the Logos, did not exist. Before he was begotten, he was not. Based on the logic that a father precedes a son and begetting has a temporal necessity of before and after, Arians claimed that God the Father and God the Son were not contemporaneous. This was bitterly attacked as a heresy, not least by those who wrote and promoted the Nicene Creed, which indeed became orthodoxy. Augustine writes with startling force about the implications of such ideas. Since God exists outside time, he argues, God could not say, "Let there be light." Because to say those words, those syllables, "let there be light," takes time. And God's language, therefore, he says, is always already spoken. It's wholly unlike the materiality of human language, which exists in time. Thus, even the Bible itself, which is in human language, of necessity can only be an approximation or portal to God's word. Unlike the generation of naive fundamentalists who insist that the Bible is simply the unmediated and unchanging and unchangeable word of God, Augustine insists that the Bible, because it is in human language, is marked by its need of interpretation, contingency, misunderstanding. The Confessions consequently ends with 3 books on how to read and interpret Genesis. Humans are destined to live in a precarious world of human meaning, humble doubt, as much as faith signals the true Christian response. Now, my final example shows this sense of reinterpretation at work. Now, my favourite poet of the 5th century is Nonnus. He's the most influential writer of the period. He wrote 2 epics, one about Dionysus, the other a paraphrase of the Gospel of John. Well, the Gospel of John begins, as you well know, in the beginning was the Word, a profound riff on Genesis. The first word of Nonnus's paraphrase of John is akronos, timeless. In the beginning marks a point in time, a starting point. For Nonus, good son of Nicene orthodoxy, this beginning is a contradiction of the everlasting nature of Logos, its contemporaneity with God the Father. So he rewrites the gospel to reflect this. Timeless, as the first word of the gospel, is now a polemical rewriting of the Christian message along more orthodox lines. The gospel's view of time wasn't quite Christian enough for Nonus. Christianity then had a new theology of time, based on the everlasting continuity of God the Father and God the Son, and on the promise of an eternal afterlife for humans, which made this world a waiting room for the world to come. Waiting for a future after death defines life, and allowed an ideal of the sexless rejection of family continuity, an ideal of continuous prayer as a sign of the proper turning towards God in the activity of holy waiting. The best of all lives had no story at all, except when necessary for the triumph of conversion or the rejection of temptation or the suffering of martyrdom. All of this is in stark contrast to Greek and Roman models in particular, the culture in and against which Christianity was formed. For the Greeks and Romans, the empty time of waiting was a failure of the pursuit of glory. The future was embodied in the family, in generational continuity, and in the fame that being remembered and memorialized provided. The Christian transformation of the classical understanding of time led to new institutions, monasteries, nunneries, the church itself, new practices of asceticism, new moral structures of behavior, new ways of being in the world that defined the West and Christian East for many centuries. If we want to understand our own relation to time, we cannot do so, I'd suggest, without understanding the pervasive and all-embracing transformation of temporality that is the Christian invention of time. Thank you. So, massive applause. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Simon. I wonder if I could have the privilege of the chair in asking, with respect to Augustine, we have both the cosmic time and also that in the passage you read out, about the Quam Deo passage you read out, a very personal existential description of Augustine's own involvement in waiting for his own transformation. Is that him? Is he mapping the grand scheme of salvation history onto his own life, or is something else going on there?
Well, that's a very big and important question. The first thing is to say that so much of the Christian writing about time takes the form of either a set of regulations about how you should spend the day. It doesn't matter if you're not married to a Christian, you still get up at 3 a.m. to say your prayers. There is no implications that might be socially difficult, embarrassing in a marriage, awkward. They say, nope, just do it. Some of it turns out to be Christian history, that is the whole history of the world, which we'll come back to, no doubt. But what makes Augustine so riveting a writer is his ability to take that personal story and map the two onto each other, the salvation history and the other. So he's I think the first and certainly the most significant writer who wants to work out what does it mean if you are a Christian who lives in waiting? Can you just wait? You're going to wait to be a bishop. You're going to do this. He's somebody who's also very involved in action. He's going to be a bishop in Hippo. He's going to do all this stuff, and we know what it means to him. He's a completely engaged. It's not as though he rushes off to live in a monastery, right? He's an absolutely engaged. So how do you turn that ideal, if you're not a monk, into living a life? And therefore, what he puts in place that I find so extraordinary is the necessity of chance or contingency. That story has. Again and again, he says, I happened to pick up this book. I happened to come across this story. I met this guy. Conversion isn't something that just happens. It is something. You can't make grace happen. And so he actually narrativizes that moment of waiting that nobody else seems to know how to wait. So when you're trying to tell the story of a saint, I chose St. Mary of Egypt because her story is, an interesting one. But There is no story of 30 years in the desert. We don't know what happens. It's just after 30 years, she gets discovered.
Compressed into a moment.
It's compressed into a moment.
Yeah, yeah,
whereas he goes, no, actually, what does it mean to wait? And that's what I find fascinating.
Great, thanks very much. Well, we've got quite a few questions have come in. One relates to one of your opening comments about centuries and living in centuries. So the comment is most references before, well, in antiquity, in Roman antiquity, are to the 15th year of the Principate of Tiberius or whatever it might be.
Sure.
So what difference does it make to start thinking about yourself as living in the century? I
think that's really a question about the 19th century, and it's a fascinating question. And if I'm going to put it in rather simpler terms, I mean, I'm going to have to compress a bit of history here. But roughly speaking, if you were at the beginning of the 19th century and there are a bunch of guys like us sitting around the table, we would have no trouble talking about time. We just wouldn't be able to do it. We'd say, yeah, sure, it goes back to the beginning of the Bible, we know where it started. Garden of Eden, creation, we got a rough over there, Bishop Usher, we can do it a few thousand years. By the end of the 19th century, if we sat around it, we just couldn't agree. If we were a physicist, a geologist, a classicist, a theologian, we'd have different senses of what deep time was. And the really transformational moment turns out to be geology. That geology appeared to provide the facts on the ground from the 1830s onwards to show that the age of the world was just much older than biblical history claimed. And this was a huge shock, and people talk again and again about the abyss of time and the dizziness they have looking at time. And of course, one of the great interventions that Darwin makes is the idea that actually there is no beginning and no end, it's all evolution. And consequently, there isn't a moment of creation or the end of the world, which is so important to Christian theology. It's all evolution, and it's sequential, and we change. We're not, as it were, made in the image of God. And those are the real threats that Darwin provided to many people. And so suddenly we start to count differently. And there was a sense that there are ways of dividing up time. And one of the ways of dividing up time is going the century, the 100 years. I mean, we've said cyclorum, century upon century, as it were, or in prayer forever. But they started to count them and mark them. And it is just simply a historical fact that people started to say, I live in the 19th century. And modernity became acutely self-conscious of itself in time. And so you start writing little articles called "The Girl of the Period," "The Girl of the Era." It's like what is a girl of the era? What is it today? What is the question of today? These sort of burning moments suddenly became temporalized in that scope. And of course, history starts to become a really dominant model in the university in these periods as well. So the 19th century is really a big transformational moment in thinking about it, and that's why I think we start talking about centuries at that moment.
Yeah, thank you. Another question about the extent to which Judaism already anticipated some of these developments. Was it not important, even before Christianity, for Jews to have a system determining precisely when the Sabbath began and ended?
Absolutely. I mean, Judaism is terribly important as a model for Christianity, which it both picks up and, of course, rejects, often virulently in various forms. But Judaism never spread beyond the group of the Jews. It's not a proselytizing religion. It didn't want to be a world religion. Christianity did. So where they pick up Jewish things and then use them, it's extremely important that it becomes then the model for the world. And that's what the big difference is. Judaism did care when the Sabbath started, but it had, if we look at the beginning of the tractate of the Talmud, Berachot, blessings, it says, well, when can you say the Shema, the standard prayer in the evening? The first story is two boys coming home from the pub. And their father, a famous rabbi, is sitting on the stairs, and they come in drunk from the pub, and he says, don't worry, you've still got time to say Shema. It's a very un-Christian story. Right? First of all, But the point is, the time to say Shema is in the evening, but the time is expandable. You've still got time to do it. You can start it. You can't start before this moment, maybe. After this moment, there might be a problem. But in between, you can discuss how much there is. And the whole of the beginning of Brachot is this long discussion of how you might think about when time is. So you're right. But
because that story is one part, isn't it?
Yeah,
The other side is well, you need to. There's a time when you can distinguish between blue and green,
and that's absolutely.
So there's a counter to that. There's at the same time a sort of strain for precision about time,
a desire for precision.
Yeah.
But what it always comes back to, which is something that Christianity has too, is the distinction between God's time and our time, and the fact that we may desire precision, but the only precision is in God's perspective. So let me tell you one of my favorite stories, which is, as we all know, in the Bible, it says, on the seventh day, God finished his work and God rested. That is the foundation of the Sabbath. When we read the Septuagint, as you have done many times in your life, you will remember that the Septuagint translates on the seventh day as on the sixth day. Right? Now, you say on the sixth day God rested, stopped his work, and on the seventh day he rested. Now, how can you translate the seventh as the sixth? I mean, it's not a question of interpretation. That's a deliberate mistranslation. And the Talmud explains it. It says, because the Greeks wouldn't understand. Ptolemy wouldn't get it. The point is that God has such a way of being in time that he can stop work on the seventh day, but that stopping of work has no duration. Whereas humans can't, they have to have duration for their stuff. So you have to have that extra hour at the beginning of the Shabbat, but before the end before sunset, to let the humans slip into it. But God has a perfect sense of time, and thus we have to translate it like that, because otherwise the Greeks would go, "Hang on, how could he stop work and not be working? He must have been working if he was stopping working." And so you can see a little argument going on about that, which is quite sweet. Yeah.
A question about the New Testament now.
You can answer this one, if not.
Luke's Gospel tells us that Jesus died at about the 6th hour, and we're told that that was about 3 p.m. What system did they use to delineate hours at that time? So it was sort of a more informational question. Were they of different lengths according to daylight hours?
Yes. I mean, the simple answer is that throughout the ancient world, until until the Middle Ages, there was no sense of going beyond the hour. And the hours were divided 12 hours of the day and 12 hours of the night. And so in summer, the days hours were longer, and in winter, the night's hours were longer. And they move a good deal in that way. And that was fully recognized. What's interesting is that, of course, minutes and seconds play no role. So when we say accuracy, minutes and seconds, we go down to what, 10 to the minus 21st of a second. Hour is quite enough. An hour is already precise enough. But notice what Luke says about the 6th hour. All right, so again, we're stuck in human time, which can never be quite precise enough. But that then gives you the model for why do you pray at a certain time? Because Jesus was crucified at that time, and that then becomes a fixed time. It stops being about that time; it becomes that time.
So in the offices that you described in the monasteries, did they have sort of water clocks or time clocks?
Yes, they did. And they also had clocks, and they had bells, and they had water clocks. They also had a man whose job it was. And Cassian gives us the instructions. The guy says you're not allowed to sleep, and you have to every day at the same time, and you can't wait for others to wake you up. You have to be there, and you have to call them, and it's your job to go and wait. It is now the 4th hour. We will now do this, or the 9th hour. Right. So it's so they had to work quite hard to get that sense of routine in place. Yeah, absolutely.
So going back to what we were saying, what you were saying previously about the sort of incommensurability of divine and human time, is that an attempt to absolutize give human time a sort of absolute character, and almost collapse divine time and human time?
Well, there's one of the long histories that I think is terribly important, is trying to think through the notion of timelessness. Now, it's almost impossible, I think, for a human to conceptualize timelessness. And there are many examples of people in the ancient world saying that. Gregory of Nazianzus says it, Gregory of Nyssa says it, Augustine himself says it. That becomes the basis of apophatic theology. We can't grasp God's time. And the reason is because we can't imagine a world that is timeless. Plato tries, various people have tried, and it doesn't work, you can't imagine it. But yet you have to try to for God. And one of the great tensions in that history is between the timelessness and the idea of the moment. How do we deal with that when you find someone like D.H. Lawrence or Walter Pater will go, we've got to live in the moment. Live for today, live now. And against that sort of moral injunction, which many Christians found so offensive, you have the idea, well, that actually there's timelessness. And God lives outside that. And those are two sort of almost impossible imaginations. What is the duration of the now? Because as soon as you say now, it's gone.
Yeah.
It was already past. So one of the great problems people have is how do you conceptualize the moment? Because as soon as you get there, it's either gone or... And how do you... But then what is timelessness the answer? And it all goes back, I suppose, to Parmenides. But we won't go there right now, the idea, right?
And to what extent do you think Jews in antiquity thought in terms of timelessness? I suppose already in Psalm 90 you have, for God a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years are as a day. Yep. Which becomes important for Christians as well.
Sure.
Is that a sort of reckoning of the incommensurability of divine eternity and human temporality?
I think there is an incommensurability, but I think it becomes absolutely central in the 4th century in Christianity in a way that it never does in Judaism. I mean, Judaism fully accepts that God is timeless, but it doesn't nag away at that problem, at least maybe till the medieval time with the Zohar it does, but that's much later. But Christianity was obsessed as you know better than anybody, with the Arian and Nicene arguments about the time that he was not. Is God the Son? How can you imagine a father-son relation in timelessness? And that's really the basic question of the Nicene theology. And of course that leads to huge rows and violence and people being killed and all the rest of it. So it's the way in which that idea of time becomes what everybody's arguing about. And there's a lovely description in Gregory of Nyssa. He says, you can't go to the bathhouse without the attendant saying, well, I think the sun is contemporaneous. He actually says that everyone on the street is talking about it. It's the hot topic. Now, of course, whether that was strictly true, I don't know how many bath attendants were discussing theology. But nonetheless, Gregory thinks it's the sort of thing you can say about the world. And I find that absolutely... So it's the way in which time becomes the big issue in the 4th century, and then carries on into the 5th century in that way, and starts to redefine the world. It's a slow change. I mean, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a long, slow change until the world becomes Christianized. But that's really what modernity is reacting against. So many modern scholars treat what modernity reacts against as if it was a given. As if, well, we all did this from the past, and now look how exciting modernity is. But in fact, we've already had the big transformation, for me, in the 4th century to the 6th century.
Right, thanks. Well, we've got quite a flood of questions. What do you make of the use of kairos in conjunction with fullness in the first words of Christ in the first gospel?
Right.
And the echoes of this in the Pauline epistles. So how does kairos, I suppose, leaving behind Homer, how does kairos?
Well, it becomes, of course, you can explain better than anybody how it becomes a technical word in Christian theology for the moment, and the idea of the plenitude of presence. And I suppose what you see is a set of really fascinating, open-ended remarks in both the Gospels and in Paul about time. And they are extremely open-ended. Right? So when Paul says, you should pray constantly, does that really mean constantly? You can see how people have to work with that. Paul also says, I die daily. My whole life is a sort of, what does that mean? Exactly. These are extreme. One of the reasons these texts were so successful is the openness in which they talk about these things. And for me, one of the hardest ways to answer that question is that a question about the first gospel, or is that a question about the long history of theology's attempt to understand the first gospel? And I think one of the big difficulties that the history of Christianity reveals is that for Paul, I think, the second coming and the end of the world was nigh. It was really near, and he really believed that. And a lot of what he's talking about is this is going to happen now. By the time you get to Augustine 400 years later, you have to be a bit more chary about saying it's happening now, because you've had 4 centuries of it not happening. And so you start to rewrite those words about what kairos means and what plenitude is and how we might think about those things over time to make theological sense of what was a hope for an instant change. Jesus did reappear. Was he going to reappear again? He reappeared, after the crucifixion. Was he going to reappear? Yes, now, kairos, right now. Well, let's wait. We don't know. It's going to happen. Yeah. And then after 400 years, it was sort of harder to be quite so enthusiastic about the immediacy.
So how do you think Paul held together that sense of immediacy, or imminence, and with that, what you described, I think quite rightly, as the sort of open-endedness of dying daily and praying constantly.
That's really the question that so many of Paul's letters aim to answer, which is, how do you live a Christian life if you think the world is going to come to an end? Does it matter? Yes, it matters intensely, because there's going to be everlasting life. And so it's picking up on so much of what's in John in some ways, or John, which history doesn't quite work that way, but as it were, you can see that John's attempts are so different from Mark, as it were, in terms of thinking about everlasting life and what the consequences of that is, and how that leads into an injunction to live. And that, to me, is a fascinating shift. If I can put it in very, very simple terms, we have hundreds of epitaphs in Greek. They are either on gravestones, or they are published, books. They're made up, but they're some fictional, some real, and it's hard to tell them apart. But we have almost none that either say, what is the afterlife? I'm just not interested in it on the epitaphs. You don't say he's going to heaven. There's one that says he's going down to hell, going down to the underworld, and it's a rotten road to go. But that's about it. And not a single one that says, because you led a good life, you're going to have a good afterlife. Simply not part of the Greek idea of the self, that what you do now is going to lead to a good life. Now, you have mystery cults, and you have Plato promising the philosopher. You have various bits that the Christians pick up on. But it's not an everyday thought, and yet absolutely central to every Christian after, once we get Christianity off the ground, is what you do now is going to affect what's going to happen to you later. That's how we understand morality. So that sense of the future, that sense of how we understand eternity, we talk about the everlasting timeless, what eternity is, defines how you live. And so it's that shift in that sense of time defines how you think you are as a human being. And that's what I find fascinating.
Thank you. Could you say something about the switch of the calendar under Pope Gregory?
Not much, to be honest. I mean, it's very important to get calendars right. And Caesar was the first. I mean, there's a very long history of, there are lots of good books on calendars that will tell you, which I can't sum it up at now. But what's crucial is to try and match the year as measured by the sun, the stars, the moon, and the sun, with how we live our lives. So for a long time, the Egyptians had a calendar that was 360 days. Well, of course, you've got to intercalate months if you're going to do that. The Jews have a lunar calendar, then you have to intercalate. And even with the calendar that Caesar had, which was much more accurate than others, it's just got out of sequence. And so Gregory had to come along and redefine it. And he did a pretty good job, and we still live with that. And of course, people got terribly upset they were going to lose a month. But that didn't happen. That's not how time works. That's again one of the problems of people working out how we think about time is so much more complicated than, until, as Augustine said, I know what time is till someone asks me, have we lost a month when we go straight from April to June? No.
Like crossing the date line.
It's like crossing the date line. Indeed.
How soon do you think these Christian ideas of time impinged on the non-Christian consciousness? I'm not sure if that's a question about modernity or about Jews and Muslims, or...
Well, I think it affects Jews and it affects Muslims as things go on, because Christendom is so important in the West. In the East, not in the Greek East, but in the Far East, it doesn't affect things until much later. But what's fascinating is that we now all do the week. We all have a Sabbath. So in a sense, of course it's impinged on people's ideas. And certain ideas of punctuality that have been invented, and certain ideas of that form, I think they do spread. They're less obvious in the Far East, I suspect. I'm not an expert on either Chinese or Japanese culture. But how strange it is that we all agree with the week still. We work from home, but we still don't work on Sunday.
Well, we have a particular kind of time that we're staring at. The countdown has now started flashing. Right. It merely remains for me, Simon, to thank you so much for both the lecture and the stimulating discussion, which I've certainly enjoyed. Yeah. And so thank you very much. I wish there was a proper round of applause that we could give you.
And thank you all for coming. It's been lovely. Great.